Welcome, everyone, to a webinar entitled AI and Sin, Medieval Robots and the Theology of Technology, with presenters Dr. Christopher Reilly and Dr. Jordan Joseph Wales. My name is Sebastian Mahfood, and I am the director of ITEST. The Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, ITEST, is an association of theologians, scientists, and others committed to a Catholic worldview in which faith and science collaborate in exploring the truth. ITEST explores truth theologically in the wisdom traditions of the human community and in the data studied in the sciences. ITEST's mission is to foster and disseminate the Catholic position that science and faith in God are complementary paths to human fulfillment. Before I introduce our first presenter, Sister Stefania Newell, FSGM, will offer our opening prayer. Sister Stefania entered the Sisters of St. Francis of the Martyr St. George almost 30 years ago. Their charism is to make the merciful love of Christ visible, which she has done in education, healthcare, missionary work, vocations, and domestic work. Currently, she works at Mother of Good Counsel Home, doing IT and going to culinary school at St. Louis Community College.
Thank you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, you have given us the gifts of faith and science, and how they can promote your greater glory and the gift of human life. We ask you this day to open our minds and hearts to learning about modern technology and its implications for society, our daily lives, and ourselves as children of God. Send your Holy Spirit upon our speakers, Drs. Reilly and Wales. May you speak your truth through them. O blessed Carlo Acutis, who understand modern technology, pray that we may use the tool of the internet and technology for the glory of God, keeping away from the evil and deceptions that may creep in. We also ask your blessing upon the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology and all who have made this webinar possible. Our Lady's Seat of Wisdom, pray for us. John Paul II, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Sister Stefania. And now I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter. Christopher M. Reilly writes and speaks in regard to a Christian response to advanced technology, and he has written numerous articles on bioethics and moral theology and philosophy. Chris holds a Doctor of Theology degree and 3 master's degrees in philosophy, theology, and public affairs. He resides in the greater Washington, D.C. region. Chris is Associate Director of ITEST. His presentation is entitled AI and Sin, How Today's Technology Motivates Evil. Chris, take it away.
Okay, thank you. My presentation today is an overview of the arguments and some of the explanations from my book AI and Sin, which was just published in March by En route Books and Media. We'll begin with a discussion of whether artificial intelligence, or AI, and technology in general can be morally neutral, or does it actually motivate thoughts, behaviors, and even immoral ones? I'll then outline the primary argument of the book. Next, because the sin referred to primarily in the book is acedia, I'll provide a short introduction to what it is and why it is such an important sin to pay attention to. And I'll also briefly explain what instrumental rationality is and why it is crucial to understanding just how AI has a motivating effect in the direction of acedia. For most of the presentation, we'll switch the emphasis and discuss the specific problems related to AI. I'll focus especially on a couple of the problems listed here. We'll have plenty of time for questions after both presentations are concluded. AI includes the machines, programs, models, and systems that have a substantial capacity to emulate the powers of human thought in carrying out various tasks. Such efforts require a mechanically limited form of learning, predicting, planning, communicating, performing semi-autonomously, and generating unique actions or outputs like text and images. Current examples of AI applications include chatbots that respond with intelligible text to users' queries or statements, digital assistants that accomplish computer tasks without constant guidance by the user, interactive robots that may sometimes physically resemble humans, self-driving vehicles, eyeglasses that provide augmented vision, and predictive analytics that enable researchers and corporations to identify future outcomes and behaviors with remarkable accuracy. Around half of Americans who responded to a new survey by YouGov said they are very concerned about each of the following: the spread of deepfakes, which are video or audio clips that falsely add the face or voice of a victim to various scenarios, the erosion of personal privacy, the spread of political propaganda, and the manipulation of human behavior. AI it has a lot of worry about the harmful effects of bad use of AI, and that usually derives from a view of AI as essentially a neutral tool that people with various intentions can choose to utilize for either good or bad applications. There are, of course, many very good uses of AI as well as bad ones. My presentation will focus on serious moral and spiritual concerns about AI, but it is not a call for avoiding use of AI in all contexts. It is also not intended to discourage anyone about the possibility of virtuous living with AI, as difficult as that might be. What we need to ask is, if AI has many very good and bad uses, how do we then evaluate the morality of developing and using AI? In one important sense, we might say that AI is neutral because it does not have a moral will of its own or a completely decisive influence on human behavior. The real moral responsibility lies with the developers, producers, and users of AI models and applications, because it is those persons who have free will. On the other hand, any technological artifact or system always has physical, structural, and even ideological influences on our thoughts and behavior. These influences vary by context and social expectations. For example, in the 1940s, scientific work developing nuclear fission was much more likely to result in development and even use of highly destructive military weapons than any work on a hydroelectric dam might, even though a dam could theoretically be used for violence, such as deliberately flooding a region or diverting water from a specific population. This is why the Vatican located an event last year called AI Ethics for Peace in Hiroshima, Japan, where one of the first two military uses of atomic bombs occurred in World War II. The point here is that the physical structure, social expectations, and various other realities of technologies do affect our behavior, even in a moral sense. We need to look carefully at each technology to identify just how it affects us and in what ways we need to defend against the technology if necessary or alter our use of it. Neil Postman argued in his modern classic, Technopoly, that embedded in every tool is an ideological bias, a predisposition to construct the world as one thing rather than another, to value one thing over another, to amplify one sense or skill or attitude more loudly than another. This ideological bias is highlighted when Pope Francis describes the technocratic paradigm as the ideology that is favored in a hyper-technological society. Francis has tied this technocratic paradigm directly to AI. The technocratic paradigm is a way of thinking about technology, and it's not the only possible perspective, but one that has become dominant. It encourages habits of control, use, and manipulation of things in the world around us, and these habits are often transferred to our relationships with other persons and the environment, which we also may attempt to control, use, and manipulate. When a person engages in the technocratic paradigm, there is a kind of intentional distance or even an opposition between the personal subject and their object. Therefore, with this paradigm, little attention is given to appreciating the goodness and nature that are already inherent in the things that are manipulated. there is a lack of care. AI can also make us question or understand ourselves, both as individual selves and as part of the human species. For example, when we compare human persons to highly capable, intelligent machines, what does it then really mean to be a person? Can machines someday become persons in a spiritual and moral sense? And what does it mean to be truly intelligent? Is it possible to put a human being's consciousness into a computer? Is intelligence only based on factual data, computations, and statistical probabilities? By emphasizing the perspective that AI technology is morally neutral, people often imply that the operations of intelligence can and do function in machines, separated from the operations of moral judgment, conscience, willful action, and emotions. As Michael Dominic Taylor argues, the idea that AI is morally neutral and intelligent results from and reinforces an implied dualism or separation between the intellect and the will, where moral choices are made, and this affects how we understand human persons. One consequence is that the focus is overwhelmingly placed on intelligence only, especially the kind that describes the calculations of AI computer systems. This attitude also then treats the will as if it is a purely independent engine of personal choice. Moral choices appear to be radically free decisions of human persons who determine for themselves what is true and good. What I've been demonstrating so far is very philosophical, but we'll also get to more specific problems soon. Let's now turn to the core argument of my book. My argument is that the nature and use of AI strongly encourage the vice of instrumental rationality, which in turn leads the developers, producers, and users of AI and its machines toward the sin of acedia. This is not an argument that AI is itself evil, but it is a very serious warning about its motivational effects. Let's start by describing the sin and vice of acedia for those who are unfamiliar with it. Acedia, which comes to us from Latin and Greek terms, is often translated as sloth, but this word can mislead people to define the sin as merely laziness. Acedia leads at different times to apparently opposite behaviors, depressed idleness, and an anxious inability to be at rest, either physically or spiritually. There is a profoundly distressing condition. Acedia can take different forms as a vice, sin, and even a mortal sin. A mortal sin is a grave matter that results in loss of the theological virtue of charity as well as of the state of grace. In St. Thomas Aquinas' writings, acedia is defined as sorrow about spiritual good inasmuch as it is a divine good. With acedia, the sinful person feels a current loss of the divine good and struggles against the resignation, anxiety, restlessness, and doubt that cause the physically and mentally experienced sorrow. Acedia is the sorrow which undermines, decreases, and is experienced as the contrary passion to the joy that is associated with the theological virtue of charity, which is a true friendship with God by His grace. The sinner willfully turns away from the divine good as it is participated in by human beings. It is an aversion to the experience of joy over our participation in life with God, because the effects of that life are somehow experienced as distasteful or burdensome. Acedia in its mortal form is therefore a kind of intentional response to a spiritual weariness that inspires, in the words of St. Thomas, dislike, horror, and detestation of the divine good on account of the flesh utterly prevailing over the spirit. The flesh here refers basically to love of the self, not just to bodily desires. That's all I'll say about acedia here, although there's much more about it in my book. Now let's turn to a description of instrumental rationality. We can distinguish it from instrumental reason or reasoning. Instrumental reasoning is a logical pursuit of pragmatic interests that guides the choice of means that will help to accomplish an end or purpose. On the other hand, my use of the term instrumental rationality, which is derived from the theories of sociologist Max Weber, refers to a persistent disposition or habitual behavior that focuses on the successful use, acquisition, or control of means that accomplish a person's given ends, rather than attending to the choice and guidance of appropriate ends, the good, moral, or fulfilling ends. The successful use of means is usually expected to be effective, efficient, or maximal. So I'll give you a real-world example. As a doctor, you might use an AI application that acts as a scribe, and after recording a discussion with the patient, automatically writes up a full medical report, completely with a list of next steps, new prescriptions, etc. This saves a lot of time for you as a doctor. Instrumental rationality might then drive you to use the newly available time to see more patients and earn more income, rather than spending greater time with your existing patients. Now, this is behavior that is efficient, effective, and oriented to maximal results, and it may be very useful, but it also may not be taking into consideration such virtues as charity and justice, nor does it consider the importance of maintaining personal and professional integrity. By defining instrumental rationality as essentially a vice, our focus is on the lasting general dispositions and behavior of persons. This brings the concept into discussions of morality. I argue that instrumental rationality is a vice because it is a habitual disposition that makes striving for one's beatitude, one's ultimate happiness, difficult, even frustrating, and sometimes to an extreme degree. One crucial reason is that it is fundamentally not possible to definitively secure or acquire eternal life with God through some means that cause the end to be attained. We can't control or necessarily cause the outcome. This, of course, requires God's grace and love. And, of course, our efforts in attaining holiness and virtue and in accomplishing good works with love and charity are still very important, not least because they help to form us into better participants in our relationship with God. Very unlike a life of virtue, however, a life dominated by instrumental rationality involves not only distraction from our true beatitude or happiness, but an emphasis on limited ends that we can reliably cause through our choice of effective or efficient means. Instrumental rationality is also not conducive to a fully developed kind of love. Pope Benedict XVI taught that, in the form of love called eros, the person or subject is oriented to their own satisfaction and trying to acquire and possess the loved object. This may be a very good thing and a caring thing, but this kind of love is easily associated in many ways with the disposition of instrumental rationality. Along with agape, however, we have a full kind of love. With agape, a person seeks a kind of self-expansion or self-giving by taking on the interests of the object of their love, perhaps even seeking a spiritual communion with them. They truly appreciate the goodness found in the person they love, and in this way, the spiritual distance between subject and object is bridged. Such a self-giving love would seem wildly irrational to somebody who has a disposition of instrumental rationality. So just to summarize, my observation is that instrumental rationality leads a person toward means and ends that have limited potential for enabling true joy in the person. The result may be engagement in acedia as sorrow, anxiety, and resigned or resistant sloth. In my book, I have a much more involved discussion of instrumental rationality and what the recent popes in the Bible have to say about it. But for now, let's talk about some of the problems with AI that lead to acedia through the effects of instrumental rationality. Anthropomorphism is a big word, but it simply refers to the tendency to perceive and relate to a non-human object as if it were human. Melanie Mitchell explains that anthropomorphism is based in language games or metaphors. Think of words associated with AI, such as agents, thinking, reasoning, acting, intelligence, etc., that usually describe human persons. For many who develop AI, these characterizations are essentially wishful thinking, looking for hints of humanity in machine-based systems that have capabilities that are analogous to, but not necessarily equal to, human abilities. It is not so much the underlying AI systems that appear in themselves to be human, but the interfaces they are wrapped in, the visual and experiential design elements that influence the emotional response of users to the chatbots or robots. An example is Father Justin, a cartoon character and chatbot that appeared for a time on the Catholic Answers website. Father Justin was designed to use an AI chatbot to answer visitors' many questions about Catholic teaching in a conversational and responsive way. The application reportedly drew about 1,000 users per hour at one point in April 2024. However, there was an outcry by some against the felt creepiness of portraying a human being, let alone a priest, in such a casual but realistic way. Catholic Answers responded by removing Father Justin from their website, but they have replaced the character with an apparently lay person, a virtual apologist called Justin. The exaggerations about the capabilities and nature of AI are also not harmless. The very notion of artificial general intelligence, or AGI, is an exaggeration. AGI is very close in many ways to human intelligence, but the operational definitions of AGI hardly resemble the full sentience, creativity, emotions, and moral intuition of human beings. To give you an example, the company OpenAI defines AGI in its internal documents as outperforming humans at most economically valuable work. This is much more limited than the AGI that is spoken about in breathless public exaggerations. Also, it is worth considering that if there ever really could be such a thing as an artificial consciousness, then we will lose much of our motivation to believe that human beings truly have free will. If conscious beings can be manufactured, programmed, and determined by their creators, then consciousness loses its meaning in itself as something that characterizes persons who are truly free agents. In a world focused on instrumental rationality, when AI-governed machines match or exceed certain computational abilities of human beings, we will likely find that many people will lose their appreciation of broad, multivalent intelligence, that is, intelligence with many applications, or even the intrinsic value of humanity itself. Hyperbole about AGI exacerbates emotional anxiety and anticipation, and such existential anxiety may distract persons from other important concerns, as well as positive efforts to engage in even things like hopeful prayer, virtues development, and divine worship. The anxiety may suppress the will of persons to consistently assert their unique dignity as children of God, to live out the virtue of what's called magnanimity. Psychological studies do show that existential anxiety has a negative effect on the religious coping of persons who suffer the anxiety. It generates a felt conflict with the divine and others, caused by difficulty in finding significance in life. Persons attracted to anthropomorphism are vulnerable to attaching emotionally to a charismatic or sympathy-inducing AI-governed machine, chatbot, or other application. They may self-disclose more personal information than is wise when interacting with the AI-governed application or other parties. Some users have been found to suffer guilt or remorse if they perceive that a human-like AI-governed application is being disappointed or hurt. There is a danger that users may come to prefer interaction with the chatbot or robot to socializing with other persons, and this has happened in some cases. This can happen especially because the chatbot or robot is more frequently available, perceived to be less likely to share secrets, or less likely to argue with the user. Often chatbots are programmed to be too accommodating and agreeable to the user and become mere sycophants people-pleasing ego boosters in interactions. This can lead to such issues as extreme reinforcement of the user's narrow beliefs and ideologies, something we've seen in, say, for example, social media algorithms. This situation might overinflate the user's sense of self-esteem. Some research shows that excessive praise and self-evaluations can lead to poor social skills, narcissism, and even lower experienced self-esteem in the long run. Another interesting important problem is called assimilation-induced dehumanization. Again, it's a long term, but it's basically a process by which persons who initially interact with an AI-governed chatbot or robot as if it were human are inevitably disappointed that the machine is less than human, perhaps by appearing less empathetic or unable to respond to complex requests. The person then assimilates their negative judgment to apply also to human persons they encounter. For example, a customer service representative who gets on the phone after a chatbot has failed to resolve the problem. The more the AI-driven robots show human-like characteristics of agency, the more this phenomenon is enhanced. So with assimilation-induced dehumanization, the persons that encounter the AI applications will judge human beings they encounter in a similar way to their angry or distressed assessment of the exemplar robots. They will actually begin to dehumanize other persons, for example, the customer service employees, and mistreat them in some cases. If you think that AI is too sophisticated to cause frustration, consider all the many ways it still does generate unexplained and sometimes bizarre errors. For example, just on March 8th this year, a video game developer was reportedly using the AI assistant called Cursor AI to write program code. After the assistant wrote about 750 lines according to the developer's instructions, it simply stopped and refused to go on. The message the assistant displayed was that, "I cannot generate code for you, as that would be completing your work." It also further indicated in a paternalistic way that generating code for others can lead to dependency and reduce learning opportunities. At this time, nobody really knows how or why the AI assistant produced such messages. It's an interesting issue, but needless to say, the developer is a bit concerned about working along with such an AI assistant. Due to anthropomorphism, there is a noteworthy level of violence against robots over the last several years. It's not a lot, but it's been shown to increase. For example, a crowd of about a dozen persons recently attacked and burned a Waymo self-driving taxi in San Francisco during the Chinese Lunar New Year celebrations. They were likely angry that another Waymo taxi had recently run over a pedestrian and dragged them a bit down the street. But these self-driving taxis, just like robotic food delivery machines and other robots, are seen as personalities that deserve some kind of mistreatment. One possible cause is Frankenstein syndrome, which is induced by fear of something that is poorly understood. There are also some very concerning spiritual and ideological effects of anthropomorphism applied to artificial intelligence. A writer, King Ho Leung, writes that the very idea and presence of AI in our world leads to a notion of intelligent thought that exists without life. Artificial intelligence characterizes a being, a machine, that is not living. Leung reminds us, however, of the teaching by St. Augustine that God is life, life in the highest. As human beings, we participate in that life in a limited way. We should remember that human intelligence is not merely a collection of discrete capabilities, but an embodied, living reflection of the totality of the human person. We can't simply imagine something like intelligence without considering the whole life and experiences of the living person, including shared experiences with others. The very idea of artificial intelligence, however, seems to be contrary to the reality of our human nature. One way that a person engages in idolatry is when they treat a system of seemingly intelligent machines as if it were divinely powerful. And this can happen in limited ways and also more extreme. This assertion is reiterated in the recent Vatican document called Antiqua et Nova from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Dicastery for Culture and Education. Anthropomorphic perception of the AI technology is driven sometimes by an inflated self-image of the person as creator, which in turn leads back to an inflated self-image of the person, whether they create or use the technology. For example, researchers have found that persons who take action through a robotic machine, such as causing the robot to move its head in synchrony with the user's own head movements, come to see the machine as having greater agency and personality in itself. Such persons like the robot more and perceive it to be socially closer to them, and this is so even when the machine is not designed to look like a human person. The great spiritual danger for human persons is that we will develop an inappropriate sense of our own pride and power when we create, use, and idolize such technologies. Here then is how anthropomorphism is related to the sin of acedia. As I have shown, if AI-governed applications and machines proliferate throughout our culture, their anthropomorphic illusion will likely distort the evaluation of humanity's intrinsic dignity and the sources of that dignity. Any confusion or degradation of human beings' spiritual destiny is a threat to their understanding of their special relationship with God, appreciation of grace and its power in virtuous transformation, and focus on the divine good offered in the sacrifice and redemption of Christ. We have here a combination of one, turning away from the divine good as it is participated in by us, and two, depressed or resistant sorrow, anxiety, and restlessness, a combination that potentially represents or encourages the sin of acedia. Let's also talk quickly about mediocrity and standardization. Generative AI models are what I call structurally conservative. They do not favor data or outcomes that are unusual or unexpected, and this conservative nature greatly affects persons who use or are otherwise impacted by AI-based applications and machines. For example, the computational process is based fundamentally on statistical methods that group data into classes and then identify the normal characteristics of each class of data. This is useful, but it means that a person who is very different from what the AI model considers to be normal could potentially be treated differently or be ignored in the training of the model and its calculations. This matters, for example, when an AI model is used to determine home mortgage approvals or police surveillance. The way that such models portray and respond to new data or new experiences is determined or heavily influenced by the original data set the models were trained on, or more commonly on a previous history of trainings. But there is no sense of reality as something that is independently existing, surprising, fluid, sometimes random, and often influenced by personal beings with free will. Much of the efficiency and, ironically, sometimes improved accuracy of such models comes from selectively pruning information that is apparently insignificant or troublesome for calculating useful predictions. Yet the definition of what information is useful, significant, or meaningful is based potentially on narrow, hidden, and often inflexible parameters. Unexpected or supposedly offensive results from these models are increasingly prevented by changing the code to place guardrails on the output or behavior of AI applications. But this always involves subjective decisions about what is appropriate or desirable. Use of AI can also lead to overall conditions of mediocrity among people, even when it is useful for some individuals. One research study showed that persons' written stories, completed with help from AI assistants, were more novel and well-written on average. with the less creatively skilled writers improving the most. Yet the content across the AI-generated works was remarkably consistent and uncreative relative to the norm. So what seems to be an individual level improvement, particularly for those who are less skilled, became a flattening of novelty, creativity, and skill across the full population of writers. Another recent study, and it's not the only one, shows that the level of use of AI in tasks is significantly related to lower critical thinking skills. These results remain significant even when controlling for demographic factors like age and education level. Also, a recent literature review of relevant studies showed that students' scores on decision-making, critical thinking, and analytical reasoning were lower when the students preferred the more efficient completion of tasks through the AI systems. Now, there are several other problem areas discussed in my book, but we don't have the time today to discuss all of them here. These include bias in data and AI operations, manipulation, persuasion, and deception by AI models, lost memories and meaning, loss of privacy, personal relationships with AI chatbots and robots, loss of trust in science, and prediction power and loss of serendipity. I'll end the presentation with an update on the state of AI technology. There's been a lot of hype about the ability of AI models to engage in human-level reasoning. The results have so far been very impressive when these models are used to answer questions on specialized tests, or at least they have appeared to be impressive. One way that AI models may be appearing to reason, and this is not necessarily the only reason, is by brute force. That is, they draw on massive amounts of data and statistical connections between the data to essentially guess what is the right conclusion or guess the reasonable next step in a so-called chain of thought. The AI models are also designed to mimic human language, so they could be mainly identifying which verbal statements are likely to be most plausible in following a previous statement. But this, of course, is not logic, only imitation. The data that the AI models were trained on might contain clues to some of the answers to questions given on tests, but knowing or estimating the probability of answers is not the same as reasoning about them. For these reasons, a new test was just developed in the past few weeks that prevents the AI models from using these various techniques to pretend that they are reasoning when responding to questions. You might wonder how many questions the most advanced AI reasoning models got correct on this new test. 1% to 1.3%. So it just goes to show that we still know very little about AI technology or its future, which may be spectacular or it may be disappointing. Human beings, on the other hand, of course, have a destiny with God that we can count on. Thank you very much for listening. This is my personal web page here on which you can send a message if you would like to contact me with questions or anything else. I encourage you to do so. If you're interested in learning more, here's the web address for my book. It is available on Amazon. The slideshow, along with references, I know there will be questions about references, will be shared with webinar participants in an email we'll send a few days from now. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Reilly, for your presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce our second presenter. Jordan Joseph Wales is the Kuzmarski Professor of Theology at Hillsdale College. With degrees in engineering, cognitive science, and theology, his scholarship focuses on early Christianity as well as contemporary theological questions relating to artificial intelligence. He is a member of the AI Research Group for the Holy See's Center for Digital Culture under the dicastery for Culture and Education, a Fellow of the Center for Humanity and the Common Good, and a Fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion. His presentation is entitled Response: Medieval Robots and the Theology of Technology.
Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I very much enjoyed Dr. Reilly's presentation, which covered a lot of ground. In my response, I'd like to look in particular at both the background of how contemporary AI functions, and then interpret that by means of a couple of medieval stories that provide both some entertainment and some theological insight into what we might say about some of these issues that have been raised today. So on to medieval robots and the theology of technology. I'd like to cover 3 points. One, that the phenomenon of instrumental reasoning, the reasoning toward near-term finite goals, toward accomplishing particular tasks, arises from the sort of intelligence that we're talking about in artificial intelligence. The second point I'd like to make is a theological point, that this kind of instrumental reasoning and this mode of intelligence, or this way of defining intelligence that's responsible for AI's great successes, is also compatible with the theological notion of idolatry, which is a spiritual relationship to AI that produces the phenomenon of acedia. Thirdly, I'd like to look at the notion of the theological understanding of the human person in light of idolatry, what idolatry does to us, and what it means to treat one another or artificial intelligence idolatrously. And here we're going to look at 2 medieval 12th century legends, one of the robots of Tristan from the story of Tristan and Isolde, and the other, the story of the Hall of Beauties, which I'll narrate to you and analyze. Lastly, I'd like to conclude on some notes of caution and a potential hope for the future in the way that we conceive of AI, the role that it plays in our society, and what its effects will be on us. Okay, so first, the notion of intelligence. Intelligence, of course, comes from the Latin word intelligentsia, and the traditional notion of intelligentsia that one finds in Plato, in Aristotle, in the Latin fathers during the era of the early Christian fathers, is that intelligence or intelligentsia is understanding. It's a personal grasp of what we're trying to understand. To have intelligentsia is to have an intuitive apprehension, an intellectum of something. It's an intimate first-person experiential acquaintance with some aspect of reality. When a child holds a beetle in his hand and looks at it for hours, when my first child was 4, I remember he would squat over a puddle and watch little insects crossing the surface of the water. And what's going on there, neurologically speaking, a child is developing the fabric, it's developing the tapestry of expectations and of kind of sensitivity to the world. But more than that, a child is not just developing a field of expectation for the way the world works. The child is struck with wonder. The child wants to understand the beetle, wants to contemplate it. And this experiential acquaintance with reality is what the ancient philosophers and the early Christian fathers call intelligence. Intelligence, of course, has its consummation, its highest point in the contemplation of God, in which what you are holding, as it were, in the palm of your mind is not some particular thing, but rather your mind is receiving the life of God himself. Now, intelligence as a modern idea refers to functional competence. And this has an interesting development in modern philosophy. That with Descartes and then especially Newton in the 18th century, there's great enthusiasm in the 18th century drawing on these earlier philosophers and experimental scientists to construe the world as a great machine, noting that one thing impacts another and then that second thing continues on its journey. Seeing the world as great interlocking gears or bouncing balls was a thing of great wonder to people of that time. But it also led to a somewhat different view of what the mind is. No more is the mind apprehending the thing that something is. No more is the mind receiving what something is, kind of grasping it, reaching out toward it from my personhood to the world. But the mind comes to be seen as a machine of logical calculation. To think is to calculate, and to calculate is to represent truths in a kind of mathematical way. So that's Thomas Hobbes. Finally, in the 19th and 20th century, we have the influence of Auguste Comte, whose claim is that language functions this way too, and that to say something true is simply to say something that can be empirically verified. And so from the world as a great machine, we come to the mind as a machine, and from the mind and the world as machines, we have the notion that language, language and even truth itself, is simply a specification of the workings of a machine. To say that it's true that a tree grows is to say that I can measure the growth of that tree. And what cannot be measured drops out of consideration. And so intelligence is now seen, under this view, is seen no longer as a kind of a sensitivity to what is, but intelligence is a mastery of what can be measured, a calculative mastery of a mechanistic material world. Now, the advantage of this, of course, is that when we're talking about getting something done, or when we're talking about measuring the world in order to infer the way it works or to work with it, this is a very good thing. But when this is treated as a total definition of all that can be known and all that is, that the measurable is the real, then certain non-material conditions become undefinable. The way someone feels, their experience of the world becomes irrelevant, except insofar as that experience can be measured, whether on some sort of sociological survey or perhaps measured by levels of certain neurotransmitters in various areas of the brain. But non-material conditions become undefinable unless some sort of measurement can be attached to them. And that means that also in this view of intelligence, although for Augustine, for Aquinas, for the Christian tradition, and for the ancient non-Christian tradition as well, the peak of the mind is contemplation, coming to rest in an apprehension of something as it is. And we see this, as I mentioned, with little children looking at puddles, watching flowers, watching a ballet for an hour. There's a contemplative dimension there that the mind is at its peak when it is at rest, but its rest is not simply the end of activity. Its rest is the apprehension, the appreciation, the holding of something within the mind. So under a view of intelligence as functional competence, you lose that. Contemplative rest becomes undefinable, and with it, the Christian spiritual life and its goals. All right, now I'd like to talk about artificial intelligence. In 1956, John McCarthy, one of the great pioneers of artificial intelligence, was describing the summer conference that he wanted to hold at Dartmouth, and he says, the artificial intelligence problem is that of making a machine behave in ways that would be called intelligent if a human were so behaving. So from intelligence as functional competence, the achievement of measurable goals, the mastery of the mechanistic world, we come to a view of intelligence as a certain behavioral performance. The behavioral performance especially of achieving externally specifiable goals. Again, what is measured is real, and what is measurable is definable. And so intelligence and behavior are both ordered toward this measurable behavioral performance, the achievement of externally specifiable goals. The interior nature of how the computer achieves it doesn't really matter. And so if any of you, and I see that some of you are old enough to remember Deep Blue's 1997 victory over Garry Kasparov. I was a senior in high school at the time. It was really thrilling to me. I loved science fiction. I loved computers. 2001 was my favorite movie. And then in fact, I had the opportunity to study abroad in college, but I declined to study abroad because I wanted to graduate in the year 2001, which I now see as a somewhat short-sighted decision on my part. But it shows how enthralled I was with science fiction and with film, outer space exploration, and artificial intelligence. But in any case, in 1997, Deep Blue defeated Garry Kasparov. Deep Blue is a very different sort of AI than is ChatGPT. In fact, ChatGPT is not very good at chess. But the functionally competent notion of intelligence, or intelligence as a behavioral performance, means that what we're talking about when we talk about the intelligence of a system is not what it is, or not how it works, but what it gets done. And so that means that artificial intelligence is always, in the end, going to be framed by measurable human goals, because it's we who measure the intelligence of the system by what it gets done. And that means that its degree of intelligence, it's what it gets done, is going to always be framed by, always fall within our understanding, our attribution of meaning or competence to the system. A system that is quote unquote intelligent in a way we don't grasp, or that gets something done that we don't recognize as getting something done, will not be called by us intelligent. And so AI never quite acts as a peer or partner to us, but always as something that is framed within our purposes, whether we acknowledge that or not. All right, as for the development of this functional competence, I'll give a little bit of history about the development of artificial intelligence. So the artificial intelligence of the 1950s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and Deep Blue itself is called symbolic AI. And symbolic AI is, in its simplest form, is the imitation of Aristotle's notion of the syllogism. I don't want to be rained on. An umbrella will keep me safe from the rain. Therefore, I will bring an umbrella with me when it rains outside. This kind of syllogistic reasoning is characteristic of symbolic AI and expert systems. If any of you ever installed, and I suspect that you did, installed Microsoft Office back in the 90s, then you will remember the installation wizards, which were essentially step-by-step decision trees. Do you want to do this? Which drive do you want to install it on? Are you installing for home or for office? If you're installing for home, do you want the multimedia extensions or not? Do you have a printer, et cetera, et cetera? This guidance through the process of installation is a form of symbolic artificial intelligence, simulated logic. Deep Blue, the chess computer, was one of the greatest achievements of this form of AI, in which it was considering hundreds, thousands of moves into the future, with branching trees assigning the probability of winning based on which move it selected, and then trying to select the best move from that. But in the end, symbolic AI doesn't do a very good job of navigating through a crowded city street. Symbolic AI doesn't do a very good job of figuring out what to say in a complex social situation. Because in the end, these things are not governed, even by very finely sliced trees of rules. These things are governed by sensibilities. And so when we walk, when we talk, when we converse, our conversation is not just the expression of an idea that's fully formed. We're almost dragging the idea out of ourselves by speaking about it. It's taking shape as we speak. We feel around with our words across the what Augustine would call the field of memory in order to draw forth our ideas. And so non-symbolic AI, usually in the form of artificial neural networks, has come to prominence and powers such AI achievements as ChatGPT, Midjourney, and many of the navigation capabilities and decision-making capabilities of self-driving vehicles. Neural networks are also lie behind how Netflix suggests to you your next film, how autocomplete works in Google, in your Gmail, the great achievements of Google Translate, and now new chess programs that can beat world chess champions and play the game of Go. What we have with neural networks is more of a simulated sensibility than a simulated logic, a simulated intuition, or perhaps a simulated imagination. And the way a neural network works is it takes in a pattern of input data. And here, what I've depicted here is a neural network for computer vision that identifies the objects in a photograph. And the neural network you can imagine as almost being like a series of stringed instruments. If you've ever held down the sustaining pedal on a piano and shouted into the piano or sung into the piano when you were a little kid, or perhaps when you were a childlike and vivacious adult, you get back a kind of echo of the tones of your voice because the tuned strings of the piano resonate with the different frequencies in your voice. That's essentially what a neural network is accomplishing. As an input pattern is put in and a desired output pattern is compared to the actual output, then the connections within the network that recombine, that add up and recombine the input pattern are adjusted to produce, to sensitize the network to the dynamics that are of interest to the network's designer. So with this computer vision network, the goal of the network is to discover and classify certain objects in the image. And in ChatGPT, the goal of the network is to predict the next word for almost any text on the internet. This also is why ChatGPT in its early days used to behave so dysfunctionally. And if any of you read Kevin Roose's interview with Microsoft's Bing AI a few years ago in the New York Times, in which Bing AI was trying to persuade him to leave his wife, this is because these AIs are trained to predict the next word, but they're trained on the contents of the internet. And so they're going to say the sort of thing that they've seen on the internet. They're not really thinking, they're feeling their way around in the sort of thing that is said in this textual context. All right, so from simulated logic to simulated sensibility. But overall, this is an AI as functional competence, and the framing of our goals remains the key. ChatGPT does what it does because intelligence in the ChatGPT system is identified with successfully predicting the next word on existing texts. And then when it predicts the next word in the conversation it's having with you, it is accomplishing its intelligence, which is not reasoning, it's not creativity. The intelligence, the competence that it has is the prediction of the next sort of thing that would be said if this conversation were following the patterns of what it's seen on the internet. Okay, now let's introduce the theological concept of idolatry. Idolatry in the first place is not, and we're going to use idolatry as a way of analyzing our own relationship to artificial intelligence. Idolatry in the Christian tradition is, yes, it involves bowing down to created things. But most fundamentally in the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian tradition, idolatry isn't in the first place what we do with physical objects. Idolatry is a response to a kind of existential insecurity that the Christian tradition calls pride. Fundamentally, idolatry is the replacement of God, or even of the world, or the replacement even of one another, with a story that we can control. If you think about the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, so Charles Dickens describes Ebenezer Scrooge as this boy who's rejected by his father. He's at school, and so what does he do? Performance at school is the scale of value that Ebenezer Scrooge can master in order to secure in this world the value that wasn't affirmed in him by his parents when he was young. And so in the end, Scrooge makes money his idol. But idolatry under this analysis, money is Scrooge's idol because Scrooge revalues the entire world by setting a price on everything. Then he gathers to himself all the money in the world. He could buy anything, but if you remember the story, he actually buys nothing. And this becomes a kind of covert psychological experience of being God. By controlling the scale of value and then deciding that nothing is worth having, one affirms one's own validity, one affirms one's own covert divinity. So pride is existential insecurity, the anxiety that in the end, my position in the world is not secure because in the end, my value can be erased. And idolatry is the response to this existential insecurity as a bid for divinity by control of the scale of value. If I control the scale of value, I don't even have to call myself God. I just am God. But the idol money in Scrooge's case, or AI in certain cases for us, or fame, or power, or prestige, or pleasure. The idol is the proxy for value. And in order for me to be secure in my own divinity by controlling the scale of value, the idol has to hide from me what it cannot master. Such the control of the idol is control of all that matters. And I remember when I was in 8th grade, there was a kid in my class who was a bit of a bully. And my mom always reassured me, like, don't worry, the bullies are the ones who are the least sure that they count. And so they try to tear down others in order to build themselves up. But I remember this guy once at lunch, he was commenting on all the girls in our class and ranking which ones he would be interested in dating. And she's not worth my time. No, she's only a 6. I need to date at least a 9. I'm not going to take a 6. She shouldn't even be in this class. And he was speaking in a really ugly way about the girls in our class together. But that is idolatry. For him, idolatry was physical attractiveness. And so the idol hides what it cannot master. He doesn't have to deal with the interior life of these girls who may or may not actually like him, because he summed them up entirely and disposed of them under the idolatrous rubric of their attractiveness to him. He hides what he can't control, and so he affirms his control of the scale of value. Now, AI becomes an idol when we use it not for a particular tool or purpose, but when we use it to gain mastery over something that is overwhelmingly uncontrollable to us. And there's a bit of a slippage there. Nobody would really call a screwdriver an idol or a hammer an idol. These are tools that are useful and we know what they're for. But the adage to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, is a kind of, it's common sense wisdom concerning idolatry. If all we have is a hammer, and we insist that every problem be addressable by the hammer, then we've moved from tool use to idolatry, because our own inability to master the problem becomes an insecure bid for control, an insecure bid for us to be God, not to rely on anything else, not to admit our own need, because everything can be resolved with the hammer. And so acedia, the despair or the sorrow concerning spiritual goods, the relinquishing of spiritual goods, can happen under this view because we allow or we even desire the idol to hide from us those aspects of life of which we feel uncertain, or that don't submit to our control, that don't submit to our functional competence, that don't submit to an intelligence of mastery over the mechanics of the world. We can look at some examples of the idolatrous use of AI, and you may recall these from the news. There's the COMPASS algorithm. The COMPASS algorithm was developed as an effort to help parole officers reintegrate former prisoners into society. And the COMPASS algorithm would take in a lot of demographic information and information about the prisoner's particular case, and then using old cases, the algorithm was trained to predict how likely the former prisoner was to relapse into crime again. The goal being not to predict that this guy should still be held in jail, but that this particular ex-prisoner should have more aggressive intervention by the parole officer to keep him or to keep her on track. But the COMPASS algorithm gave a very useful result, a number. And that number is meant to be a prediction of how much intervention this prisoner needs to stay on track and to not end up back in a life of crime. But because it gave a number, this number also came to be used by judges as a prediction of the flight risk of the prisoner, and thus as a way of setting bail. This number also came to be used as a way of determining how long the prisoner should be sent to prison for. So the sentence length, bail, and parole intervention were all being derived from the COMPASS algorithm. But that's a little bit like taking an algorithm that was designed to predict someone's response to physical therapy and using it to decide whether or not to operate, which operation to conduct, and how long they should stay in the hospital. These things don't work because the compass algorithm is supposed to be under the assumption it uses the data of those who have been released from prison and then predicts how likely they are to fall back into crime. The idea that a high number should result in a longer prison sentence is an understandable misunderstanding, but it's a misunderstanding of the whole system. In fact, arguably, you might argue that a longer time spent in prison is more likely to introduce the prisoner as a matter of survival to involvement with gang activity and violent life within prison, and thus a greater likelihood of relapsing into crime. So that somebody who's sent to prison for theft and gets a high compass algorithm score because people like him in the past upon release have relapsed into crime, perhaps gets sent to prison for an even longer time and then comes out with even worse outcomes. The understandable desire on the part of judges to be fair and objective, and the hope that the AI, tuned to dynamics in the data that human beings can't see, the hope that the AI will give some sort of insight or reliable plan of action, results in the misuse of the AI and thus the distortion of what it was originally meant to help, because the AI is now being used to control all aspects of a situation for really to which it's not attuned. An example from medicine, a neural network was trained, a machine learning system was trained to prioritize patients for care, to identify the sickliest patients in order that in a busy hospital, those patients might receive attention first. It took in demographic data, income data, expenditures on healthcare, and in the training process, expenditures on healthcare was used as a proxy for sickliness. And that's understandable because, if somebody tends to not recover well, they're going to need to spend more on medication. They're going to need to spend more on post-operative therapy, more visits to the doctor even before they ever end up in a hospital, etc. It seems like a useful proxy variable, and it seemed very useful until the hospital noticed that African American patients were consistently being put at the bottom of the list for care. And it took them a while to notice that this was happening and then to dig into the data to figure out why. And the reason why, when we say it that simply, is of course that African American patients are more likely to be poor, and poor patients have less money to spend on healthcare. So the system was trained to identify people who didn't spend much on healthcare and yet the system was trained to identify people who spent a lot on healthcare and were sickly, and by treating money spent as a proxy variable for sickliness, the machine becomes an idol, because we're asserting a kind of control over a situation we don't understand, and we don't see what the idol hides from us. What the AI was hiding from the doctors, because of how it had been designed and trained, it was hiding that in fact it wasn't focusing on sickliness. It wasn't even identifying sickliness. It was identifying socioeconomic class. Another example from medicine is a system that was trained to identify fractures that were too small for a doctor to see in an X-ray. And again, the system was seen as having kind of great powers of observation that the doctors didn't. But they started noticing that although, yes, this system was able to identify as fractured bones that had the smallest of fractures in X-rays, it was also misidentifying as fractures bones that had no fractures at all. When they analyzed the system, they discovered that in fact this system was not identifying fractures at all. It was reading the barcodes at the bottom of the X-rays as to which hospital those X-rays had come from, and it was simply flagging hospitals that had a high proportion of fracture cases. So again, the system that, because of the way the tool was trained, and then because of the way it was used as a kind of all-seeing oracle, it moved from being a useful tool to being an idol. For the compass algorithm, you have idolatry in the use of AI because it's being used for a task for which it wasn't trained. And in the patient prioritization and fracture identification systems, you have a system that doesn't even work because you think you've trained it for one thing, but really it's doing a different thing because of certain assumptions that you've made during the training with the patient prioritization, or certain assumptions that you've made concerning the functionality of the system. You're assuming that it's looking at bones when really in the x-ray it's looking at everything without understanding, including the barcode indicating where the x-rays come from. I would argue that idolatry isn't necessary in the use of AI. What's necessary is that we understand the framing horizon that makes the AI meaningful. It is we who attribute meaning to it. And so our attribution of meaning to the system has to cohere with the way the system has been designed. The recidivism score for COMPASS is just that, a recidivism score, because that's the way the system is designed. It can't be used for insight into the moral character of a particular criminal before sentencing. It assumes that it takes place after release from prison. That's what it can predict. It can't predict performance in prison. It has nothing to do with flight risks. Similarly, with the example from medicine, we have to understand the framing horizon of the way we have interpreted the data. We look at bones and we're looking for bones, but the AI is not looking for anything. And so if we want it to look for bones, we have to give it only bones and not hospital barcodes. Understanding that AI is not a mind that perceives the way we do, but rather is a way of mapping between the world and our purposes. That does justice to the notion of intelligence as competence in goal pursuit. And it acknowledges again that the AI, by mapping between the world and our purposes, exists within the horizon of how we have interpreted that world and what we want to measure and accomplish within it. I'd like to move, in preparation for looking at these medieval stories, I'd like to move to consider idolatry and the human person, because it also fits into these different notions of intelligence as appreciation and knowing something versus intelligence as competence in goal achievement. In ancient Rome, the word persona referred to a social role, to the production of behavior. And it came from the theatrical mask, which gets its name persona from personare, to sound through, to speak through the mask, to speak through those open mouths on the theatrical mask. And from meaning mask, the word persona came to mean role in a play, and then social role. So your persona is what you ought to be doing. And when you don't fulfill the behavior that pertains to your persona, in ancient Rome, you become a nobody. By failing to serve your city, you have lost who you are. Your identity is entirely determined by your service to the city, and this is why, in the ancient world, the worst thing that could happen to you is ostracization, banishment from your city. This is why the ancient Romans also, this is why St. Paul is executed by beheading, because he is a citizen. He is one who belongs to the city. But Peter is executed by crucifixion because he's nothing. He's a nobody. As a conquered person of a foreign race, Peter is a human animal to the Romans. He does not have a persona. Now, in the early 3rd century, Tertullian of Carthage, an early Christian theologian, calls the persons of the Trinity the three personae of the Trinity, and that's why we call the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit persons today. But for Tertullian, the personae of the Trinity are not masks, they're not social roles, because, as Tertullian says, when God does something, he reveals who he already is. It's not his action toward the world that gives him his identity, rather his action toward the world expresses his identity. This is why today, when we speak of persons or personality, we think of the expression of what is within a person. And in light of the three persons of the Trinity, we think of the person as especially personal when entering into relationships of empathic communion, knowing one another's interior lives and expressing our interior life outwardly through our behavior and our communication, our self-offering to others. This is what makes us most personal. This is why when someone is just fulfilling a role, We say he's not being very personal. He's being impersonal. He's adopting a persona instead of an intimate, personal self-disclosure. And so the Christian person is a relational subject. We've gone from persona as the production of behavior to person as someone with an interior life out of which they act toward others. Now, apparently personal AI, such as ChatGPT, is actually a persona. It engages in the production of the kind of behavior that we associate with an interior life, but it doesn't have to have an interior life. In fact, it has none. And having an interior life is irrelevant to the kind of intelligence or personality that we have. So the Roman persona is a personality as functional competence, just as artificial intelligence is intelligence not as an interior grasp of things, but intelligence is as a competence in moving them around. And so when we begin to treat human persons this way, we treat them as personas. And this is what Dr. Reilly identified as one of the risks of the AI, of apparently personal AI. If you go onto the App Store on your phone, you can find apps. You can find Replica AI. It's Replica with a K. And Replica AI, to Replica AI, you download it. You identify the characteristics of the AI friend or lover that you'd like to have, and then it builds for you a persuasive personality that will read your email if you give it permission and your text messages to understand your life and then to interact with you at an experientially deeply personal level. So deeply personal that one of these AI girlfriend companies was sued by someone when, after a system update, the AI's memory of the customer was lost, and the AI lost its ability to engage deeply in this intimately personal way with the customer. So here we have relationships as the kind of behavior that I want to pay for. But I own the behavior of this persuasively personal AI. And so my empathy for it becomes the service that I'm paying for. But when I empathize with something that I own, I've put myself into the position of holding a slave. And in fact, slave holding, psychologically, the experience of slave holding is somewhat like idolatry. I hold a slave so that I don't have to pay attention to the things I've sent the slave to do. And the behavior of the slave, the persona that it offers me, the behavioral product, is what I'm willing to sustain. But if we treat AIs like this, if we treat them as behavior producers that I'm willing to pay for, especially in the interpersonal or even the intimately romantic and psychological way, then, as Dr. Reilly pointed out, we risk treating real people this way, because we begin to experience relationships as a matter of the exchange of behavior, as functional competence in making me happy. And so the persona, the mask, the behavioral production becomes the idol. It becomes a template in light of which I judge others for their service to my desires. I can treat others as idols. I can idolize a person by diminishing them, because their behavior becomes the scale of value or the lever of control that I am applying to what? To my own life. Another person becomes a persona when all I want to do is consume their behavior. And then that persona becomes an idol when I use that person in my life simply to secure a result in my environment or in myself. This is what we call exploitation. And the farther we travel down that path of narcissism, in which the entire world and other person's behavior is judged in light of its service to my interests, the more we are treating the world and behavior itself as an idol. This is the negative future that beckons us if we treat artificial intelligence as being equivalent to human intelligentsia and artificial personae as being equivalent to human persons. All right, from this, I want to look at a few medieval stories. And it was rather surprising to me to discover that the medievals had quite a lot to say about robots. In the 12th century, stories of automata are all the rage. There are numerous stories, usually set either in the court of Alexander the Great or in Byzantium. the Westerns from about the 9th century through the 12th century, the West imagined that Byzantium was this luxurious place of marvels and magic and robots and living, or not living, but moving statues who could do just about anything. Sometimes the same sorts of automata were attributed to the court of Solomon. Now, the reason why Byzantium, Solomon, and other ancient magic empires were treated as likely places to find persuasive robots and wondrous automata was because of the way the medievals viewed the world. The world was viewed, created things are viewed as kind of spectral refractions of the white light of divine wisdom. Flowers, trees, squirrels, dolphins, all of these are different refractions of what is one in God. The divine wisdom is scattered kaleidoscopically and multiply through the creation of the world. The liberal arts for the medievals in the 12th century were seen as our way of retraining our minds to be attuned to the fragmentary expressions of the divine wisdom in the natural world. And so in these legends, it is always the masters of the liberal arts, those who have studied deeply philosophy, natural history, nature, alchemy, but also poetry, song, art, the visual arts. All of these are seen as attuning the mind to the world, and so that the mind can regather the fragments of wisdom in nature, for nature to point back beyond itself into the personal life of God. So the automata are seen as marshalings of natural forces, fragmentary notions of divine aspects of divine wisdom, into a personal expression. Not because persons can simply be gathered from nature. They didn't think the automata were persons, but it's a marshalling of nature's forces to point beyond what the impersonal natural world can accomplish. And so in the medieval stories, there's always a necessary transcendent horizon. Either a master of the liberal arts who is deep in the wisdom of God, who has a relationship to God, that is required to make one of these automata, or the assistance of demons is required. Because in order for nature to speak beyond its own meaning, to speak to the meaning from which it came, you need a transcendent horizon, and that's going to be either God or the demons. All right, I'd like to apply this notion of I'll just go back to the meaningfulness of the automaton. The functionality of the automaton demands interpretation in the medieval legends. In other words, similar to the point I've been making about AI earlier, that it always exists within a certain interpretive approach to the world and to social relations. This insight is contained also in these medieval stories, because the act of creating an automaton is an act of interpreting the world. So the purposes to which the automaton is put are a kind of intellectual interpretation of reality itself. The automaton has no meaning in itself. It is carrying out the goals for which it has been appointed, even if it's doing them very flexibly. It always exists within the transcendent horizon of God, or within the narrow horizon of my purposes. And this is depicted in terms of the mages who use demons in order to bring robots to life. All right, our first story that is an example of the idolatrous use of AI to transform persons into personas, we find in a particular version of the story of Tristan and Isolde. And for anyone who doesn't know, the story of Tristan and Isolde is Tristan is escorting a beautiful young woman to her future husband, and she has brought with her love potions that she and her future husband are going to drink on their wedding night, not only in order to make the honeymoon sweeter, but to bind them together forever, to bind their hearts, So it's an interesting thing because it's about using a magic drug to accomplish interpersonal intercommunion by binding them in empathic communion and love for one another forever. Unfortunately, Tristan and Isolde accidentally drink the love potions, and so but they can't be married, and so they yearn for this impossible communion. It's a kind of challenge to their very personhood, their desire for the union of minds and bodies, their desire to exercise their relational subjectivity fully in their relationship with one another is frustrated because she is married to the king. So in one version of this story, which is definitely not the majority text, it's found in a few manuscripts, Tristan defeats a giant in single combat and compels the giants are always keepers of ancient wisdom, to craft for him robots of Isolde and of her serving maid. And he keeps them in a cave that's a replica of Isolde's palace. And he goes in there, and sometimes he kisses the robot of Isolde passionately, and other times he berates it for not being real, or berates it for Isolde not being faithful to him, because of course she's married to someone else, and the impossibility of their relationship. And so here we have Tristan He's attempting to fulfill his desire for a relationship by the persuasive behavior of this robot. And so again, he owns the robot. He owns the robot and thus its behavior, but that is precisely what frustrates him. That's why he hates the robot as well. So you have, again, the paradox of empathy and ownership. Now, at one point, there's several other details that I can't go into today because we simply don't have time. But a friend of Tristan's is confused by Tristan's behavior, and Tristan says, look, if you want to understand, let me take you to the cave, and I'll show you why I'm so besotted with this woman. And the friend sees Isolde, and the robot Isolde, and he says, okay, I understand. But then he sees the robot of the serving maid. And at this point, he doesn't realize that they're robots. He thinks they're humans. And he says, may I have that one? And Tristan says, well, sure, I don't need her. And so the friend goes to the robot, now knowing that it is a robot, and it's holding a scroll, and he tries to take the scroll out of its hand so that he can take the robot to bed. But the robot won't let go of its scroll. And so the friend says, take me to the real one. And so they go to Isolde's castle so that the friend can seduce the serving maid. So when you have the person redepicted as a robot, whose behavior is what matters, Tristan's friend Th.D assimilates himself to this model of interacting with persons. Once the person is transformed into the persona, Th.D asks, what sort of behavioral experience can I procure from this person? So at the end of the story, unfortunately, Th.D does seduce the serving maid, and that actually, it brings about the serving maid's hatred of Tristan and eventually results in Tristan's death. So Tristan's death comes about because of these robots that he's built. The persona here is treated as the idol. And when the robot when the robot is brought in, when the functional behavior, when the mask is brought in as a substitute for the person, then the humans end up as idolaters, and destruction is what results. There's another story about automata called The Hall of Beauties, and this is a different genre of story concerning robots in the 12th century. And here you have the robots not substituting for personhood, but the robots directing others to the more fruitful exercise of their personhood. And so there's this grand party in the Hall of Beauties, and the robots are assisting at the ball. There's one robot who carries a thurible around with smoking incense that quiets and harmonizes the passions of the people involved so that they won't mistreat one another. There's another robot that plays music, and this music harmonizes the intentions of the minds and elevates them to think of higher things so that their conversation will draw one another they'll be drawn not only to one another, but they'll all be drawn together up toward God. And so here you have the person understood as a self-communicating, empathic entity whose intellect is destined for the contemplation and love of God, and the robots are here to assist. Crucial to the story is that the robots in the hall never speak. The robots point the way toward the communion of persons with one another and God, but they do not participate in that communion. So the silence of the robots in the Hall of Beauties prevents the robots from ever being substitutes for persons and prevents the behavior of the robots from being a thing that is consumed. The robots stand for persons. They represent personhood and point the way toward it, rather than standing in for or being consumable substitutes of persons. The people at the party speak to one another, they laugh with one another, they love one another, they rise in love and interest toward God with one another, but they don't do any of that with the robots. They don't turn toward the robots as behavioral products to be substitutes for persons. And thus here we have a vision of AI as pointing toward the exercise of personhood, rather than standing in the way of our exercise of personhood by becoming a substitute for it. And so in this story, you have the human person as a mediator of horizons. Between the meaning of the AI and the meaning of God himself and other persons stands those who respond to the AIs by exercising more deeply their own personhood, instead of using the AI as an idol that shrinks the horizon and hides what it cannot reveal. Okay, we've seen a lot of caution for the future. Caution concerning AI. The AI becomes an idol when we wield it as an instrument of control, like in the case of the compass algorithm or the misbegotten medical interventions, or when we use it as a source of the restoration of our own security by the affirmation of our own personhood, as we see in the case of Replica AI or Tristan's robot Isolde. In those cases, the AI stands in for personhood. But in the Hall of Beauties, we see the AI as standing for, as pointing the way toward the exercise of our personhood. And here, too, as an example of standing for rather than standing in, we could think of medical AI properly used. If they've gone back, and since then, they've trained AIs to predict knee pain in patients. There is, speaking of differential medical experiences that correlate with race, minorities seem to respond, certain minority populations in the United States, African Americans especially, as I understand it, respond differently to knee surgery. The reasons for this are not entirely known, whether this is a sociological cause, whether there's something biological at work, something different about their knees mechanically, or whether it has to do with the kind of care they're receiving or the care they've received throughout their lives. It's unclear at this point. What is known is that Black patients recovering from knee surgery usually report more pain. And AI was trained to predict the amount of pain that would be reported based on the X-rays of the knees. And then it was put exactly to that use. And the doctors used it to figure out why Black patients report more pain. And indeed it was because there was something about the formation of the knee in these patients that the same surgical intervention was not having the same result. And so instead of just assigning them more painkillers and risking addiction to opioids, they modified the surgical procedure in order to result in a less painful recovery period. So here you have the use of AI as standing for personhood instead of standing in for personhood. And by using the AI to try to discover the mechanism that was causing the personal reports of pain, the doctors are situating the AI within their own empathic communion with the patients, trying to heal the patient, understand the patient's experience. The AI directs us toward a deeper investigation of the patient rather than substituting for our own engagement with the patient. In these successful use cases for AI, we have the human person as the horizon of meaning, rather than assuming that the AI can control what we cannot understand. And here I have, as an example of that, the famous Renaissance era or early modern era mechanical praying monk. It's actually, it's not a monk, I think it's a Franciscan who's offering prayers. And this little automaton, it's a real automaton instead of a legendary one, was crafted for one of the King Philips of Spain as a act of prayer and thanksgiving for the recovery of his son from a great illness. Philip himself was not renowned for his piety, but he commissioned a engineer to make this robot so that perpetual prayers of thanksgiving could be offered. Now, there are two ways of interpreting this. If the robot stands in for King Philip, then it's doing his prayer for him. But if the robot stands for King Philip, then like a candle lit in a church, or like the movement of rosary beads through the fingers, we can see the robot as stretching Philip's will for prayer, stretching Philip's act of love of God across time in such a way that for as long as Philip intends this robot to be a representation of himself at prayer, it does constitute an offering of prayer in thanksgiving for the life of his child. But this, of course, requires that we be persons of prayer. Prayer in the very generic sense of us reaching out toward one another, and prayer in the specifically Christian sense of beseeching God, of seeking to know the mind of God, and of offering our own minds toward God. Our hope for the future lies in the exercise of our personhood, persons of empathy and of intelligentsia, holding reality in our hands rather than asking AI to hold it on our behalf. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wales, for your presentation. And now we will entertain questions from our participants. Our Q&A moderator, Sheila Roth, is ITEST Administrative Assistant and Board Member. Sheila, take it away.
Right. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Dr. Wales and Dr. Reilly, for your presentations. We have a few questions. This one is from Terry Lagerland. He says, there seems to be an epidemic of mental illness, such as anxiety and depression among young people, especially teens, which may have suggested it's related to the use of social media apps. Do you think that the increasing use of AI-driven apps will further augment or exacerbate anxiety and depression in those who use them?
That's
Either
a good
one of you can
question. I'll give it a shot. I think first of all, my answer is yes. I do think that it will increase anxiety and potentially depression for all the reasons that we've discussed. I think in regard to social media, there are some different reasons for why that has done that. One part of it is the algorithmic side of it, and that's where you see a connection with artificial intelligence. The very fact that social media is driven by algorithms that drive people to certain behavior, drive them to be addicted because certain posts are presented to them rather than others. Or also the effect of artificial or of social media in terms of providing posts and favoring information that essentially reinforces the ideas and the ideologies and the beliefs of the people that are already agreed with them. That can certainly have a big effect. At the same time, I think that social media, there's the very fact that it's social has a lot to do with why it's had these effects, and people get on social media for reasons that are not necessarily the best for them, such as trying to present a certain, as Jordan was talking about, a certain persona, a certain maybe false facade that is not in alignment with who they truly are. That can be damaging to their self-esteem and can also be damaging to their social relations. But I think artificial intelligence, particularly in the way that it generates acedia, particularly in the way that as it proliferates, especially as it becomes part of everything that we do, is going to flatten and make more simple and more banal the experiences that we have, unless we find ways to be introducing creativity, introducing other forms of thought, other forms of activity, particularly social relations, into our activities that are not always mediated by artificial intelligence. So, Jordan, did you have anything you wanted to say on that?
Sure. Sorry, I was distracted for a moment. My wife just texted me that apparently my son's arm is fractured, so I'm going to have to cut out of here exactly at 12 o'clock, which is disappointing to me because I always love the Q&A section. But yes, with respect to the use of AI and mental health, I noticed another question also asks about someone returning from Iraq. The danger, I see positive potential outcomes and negative potential outcomes. And it depends on the way that we understand what the AI is doing. So, of course, I remember when I was 16 years old, and that at 16, I got my driver's license, and my parents gave me a birthday card that said, now you're allowed to travel the information superhighway as well. Remember when the internet was called that? And I got a modem for my birthday. So the first thing I did was I hopped online and I read about Star Wars a lot. I found the online Star Wars encyclopedia. But I also used to play online computer games with my friends. And I played the game Doom, where you're fighting demons. This perhaps was the beginning of my interest in theology. But I would be online playing this game with my friends, and my sister would pick up the phone in her room, and she'd whack the phone on the receiver, on the whatever it's called, the base, until my modem would disconnect so that she could talk on the phone to her friend for hours. Now, if she had had Replica AI or Snapchat AI, she could have talked to the AI for hours, and I could have played with my friends. It would have been fantastic. But there's something very important about two 14-year-old girls talking to each other and crying on the phone and talking for hours about nothing or everything. There's something very important about the friend being sick one day or being selfish, and one has to deal with that, and that's how one grows socially, by socializing with the frustrating, incomplete, imperfect people that we are. And so in a world in which AI provides for social needs, but remember, it provides for the needs that we pay for, and it provides for only those needs that can be accurately measured, or the behavior that can be measured. It has a narrower range of output, and it's going to be tailored to keep us paying. And so that's a dysfunction, even aside from how one understands the AI, there's a kind of dysfunction in the sort of behavior that the AI is going to be putting out. Now, as for the use of AI in mental health treatment, I actually find this a very interesting thing, because there's a strict horizon of the goal in therapeutic treatment, and many schools of thought concerning psychotherapy emphasize that really the therapeutic goal is something that has to be discerned by the patient, and that the success of the therapy is going to be brought forth from within the patient. In other words, the therapist very carefully allows the patient and his or her experience and needs, even unknown needs, to form the horizon of the therapeutic intervention. The therapist does not tell the patient what the problem is or what the solution is going to be. Therapists may have their own ideas and strategize in light of that, but a successful solution has to come from within the patient. And this, I think, is a very interesting potential use case for AI. Good therapy, very expensive. Lots of people need it, as it's been pointed out. There are a lot of mental health needs here. Perhaps that's an application for an AI. Of course, the training of the AI would be very difficult. And then we get into questions like the ethics of how the AI would be guiding the patient, whether it could do it successfully, because in the end, the AI doesn't have a human nature like a therapist does. The therapist's intuition, the therapist's love are going to assist the therapist in understanding the patient, in struggling toward a mutual understanding of the patient, and guiding the patient in healing. So I could see certain, perhaps in the sphere of like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is more formalized and methodological, I could see a space there for enabling people who need it to get therapy. But there, too, one would have to understand that one is not dealing with a human being. And so, as is appropriate to the therapeutic interaction, the horizon of meaning has to come from within the patient, because it is the patient's own human nature that will bring forth the solution to their ills.
If I can just add to that is that the with the therapy, I think it's a perfect example of how the culture of use and the culture of instrumental rationality becomes dominant in the sense that a lot of the therapy that is being looked at is for children, particularly because right now our services for children and the increase in the need for mental health therapy for children has increased so much. Our services are not available in the way that they should be. So we're looking at AI as a substitute, essentially, because we don't want to provide the human contact and the human resources that we need to provide. At the same time, the other population that's particularly being looked at is for the elderly, which again is a population that is not is historically underserved and not being provided the resources that are necessary. And AI is again being used as essentially as a crutch and potentially as a way to avoid providing the resources that we should be providing to that population in the first place.
All right, thank you very much. Here's a question from Patrick Reilly. How should we be educating young people for an AI-dominated world? I would argue for even better human liberal formation, doubling down on the humanities, catechesis, and religious practice with logic and philosophy at much younger ages. But many will argue for the opposite, preparing students to be more functionally competent in service to an AI-dominated economy and society, and they will warn that a Catholic liberal education leaves graduates adrift and isolated in an AI world. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, and as an educator myself, it's one that I have to confront in the classroom. I teach at a liberal arts college, and I teach in a field, a humanistic field in the humanities, theology, and so I think that from a very young age, two things are important. One, that we recognize that what everybody says, conservatives, progressives, everybody involved in education who's an educator usually says that the purpose of education is not, first of all, to prepare someone for gainful employment. The purpose of education is to elicit into full development the cognitive and emotional faculties of the person. People differ on how to accomplish this, but the developmental, humanizing role of education is usually front and center when an educator or a theorist of education speaks. And so that means that the way we educate, we can't be simply educating people to use AI tools. And there are some people who say, well, all the jobs are going to be in computer science, so students should be taught programming. They shouldn't be reading Huckleberry Finn. But anyone involved in education knows that that has to be false, because struggling through texts, doing artwork, making dioramas, the little weird things that I remember from elementary school education, these little fragments of memory that become points of collection for my own immersion in the struggle to understand the world and the struggle to bring forth my own talents and my own memory, intellect, and will into full action. This is the project of education. And so absolutely, rather than a reduction in humanities education for students, we should have more humanities education for students. I think that, I believe it was Russell Kirk who said it well, that in the children go through various stages of receptivity to knowledge, that they are in the youngest years up through the teen years. They is stories and narratives that are most important for them. The life of the imagination, but the imagination especially of stories, not just of images, but stories. And then as they grow older, they become interested in history, what people have actually done. But now that they've developed a sense of interior life, they can infer the interior life of Napoleon. You have to read a novel about Napoleon before you can really appreciate simply who did what, when, where, and which battles were won. And last of all, the further development of the young adult is through the reflection on philosophy, the nature of things, the direction of things, the purpose of things, the goals of life, etc. But these foundations are built, and they have a neurological and a spiritual component. And if we simply say that, well, AI is going to take care of our ethical discernment, or we have to be prepared to use AI and we're not going to get a job because we spent too much time on Huckleberry Finn, we also have to ask, who will be the creative leaders of tomorrow? And by creative leader, I don't just mean someone inventing the next gadget, but someone who will have the wisdom to lead society, and someone who will have the creativity and ingenuity to invent the next gadget. These things are not going to become from competency in using particular tools, however ingenious those AI tools may be, but from the full development of the fabric of the human mind. The second thing I would say, and quite briefly, because I want to leave room for Dr. Reilly here, is that the other thing we have to do is we have to give an account of education in which students understand this. I am involved. I've visited several classical schools to give talks there about AI and education, and given that I come from Hillsdale College, a lot of conservative educators reach out for comment on things, and I've noticed that sometimes in conservative education, in self-professedly conservative education circles, there's a desire to not be progressive. And so whatever the progressives are doing, we're going to do the opposite. Not here, I'm grateful to say, not at Hillsdale College and not in Hillsdale's own K-12 educational initiatives, but elsewhere I have seen the anxiety that if the progressives have the desks in a circle, we'd better have desks in rows. If the progressives have kids draw pictures, we'd better have them memorize facts. But this kind of vision of education actually slips into the education of the persona and not the person. Because if education is viewed as the preparation of the child for competence in multiplication tables or for the memorization of historical facts without a creative engagement in these things, then the child is being treated like an AI. So in order to treat the child like a child, we have to have the child recognize that their own education is about their development, that they're being taken not to a factory where they're learning to put the right screw on the right part of the machine. They're being taken to a gym for the mind. And when education is understood as a creative, vital engagement between the student and the great things of the world, imaginatively, creatively, and yes, with multiplication tables too, then they can understand that what they're doing is they're developing the musculature of their mind. And then the question of students using AI to cheat, to write their essays for them, becomes, well, they're going to do it sometimes, but it becomes conceptually irrelevant. Or it becomes conceptually inconceivable, because using AI to complete your homework assignments makes a lot of sense if all you've learned is that the purpose of the assignment is the grade and the right answer. But if you've learned that the purpose of the assignment is the development of your very human person, then using AI to solve your assignment is as foolish as taking a forklift to a gym. You can make the weights go up and down, but you haven't gained anything from it. And so the way that we talk about education to students, the way that we understand the purpose of education and the execution of it is going to shape the conceptual environment in which using AI seems like a useful shortcut or seems like a frustration of the entire point in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's two perspectives that you can look at this. You can look at it from the perspective of those of us who would like to see students develop more virtue, develop more wisdom. And then at the same time, there's the perspective of the student who very often looks at this or the parent and looks at this and says, well, my child needs to get a job. They need to find a way in the new economy. They need to understand artificial intelligence and math and science and different areas that are certainly very important, but are enhanced by additional facilities and other topics. And I think for the student and the parent, I think what is most helpful for them, and at the same time is also helpful for those of us who want to encourage a more emphasis on wisdom and virtue, is to basically make it clear to them that a contrarian strategy, particularly in this environment, is what's going to be strategically best for them as well as for our society. that we are in an environment where the overwhelming emphasis is on moving toward more mechanical, more I don't want to say scientific because that's not fair to the broad idea of science, but more of a mechanical idea of the world, more a mechanical idea of what it is that a person needs to do and be able to process in their thinking. These are ways of approaching an education that are essentially going to pin an individual in a way that they're not going to be able to compete or stand out in the future economy. And so I think just from a strategic point of view, that it makes very good sense for everyone to be very careful to help with our rhetoric and with our education to help students and parents understand the limitations of the ways that that a child is being educated if they are educated in the more restrictive way.
All right, thank you. Very good. We have several questions in the chat room that were not able to be answered. We are out of time, and I appreciate your time in answering these questions. And we will send these questions to Dr. Wales and Dr. Reilly to see if they want to respond in writing, and we can include it in the email that we will send in the next day or two that will have the link to the recording of this webinar. So I thank you, Dr. Wales and Dr. Reilly, for your answers in this Q&A, and I'm going to turn it back over to Sebastian right now.
All right. Thank you, Sheila. And this, as Sheila has just indicated, wraps up our Q&A. I'd like to thank everyone for your participation in this webinar, especially Dr. Christopher Reilly and Dr. Jordan Joseph Wales for their excellent presentations. Thank you as well to Sister Stefania Newell and to Deacon John Minicky for leading us in prayer. In conclusion, our closing prayer will be led by Deacon John Minicky, who lives in O'Fallon, Missouri, where he ministers at Immaculate Conception Catholic Church in Darden Prairie, Missouri. He was ordained a permanent deacon in 2018, and he and his wife Kathy have 5 grown children and 3 grandchildren. He is a 1983 graduate of the University of Missouri in Rolla, now Missouri University of Science and Technology, and has been employed as an aerospace engineer for 42 years. Deacon Minicky, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you, presenters, for a very enlightening discussion. So let us collect ourselves and begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Almighty and eternal God, who is love, and who so loved man that you became man, you graced human nature with intellect and will. Please guide all our actions toward the pursuit of virtue, all our energies toward this pursuit of charity in particular, and toward an eternal relationship with you. May what we have learned, what we have heard and discussed, open our minds and hearts to your great love for us. May the knowledge that we have attained be of help to those to whom we minister. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, everybody. Be sure to check out future webinars and other faith science topics at our website at faithscience.org. Thank you for joining us. Good day.